My name is Bridget Fallon, and I want to tell you something before I tell you anything else. I am not the kind of woman who ends up in stories. I am the kind of woman who fixes things when stories go wrong. I lift what needs lifting. I carry what needs carrying. I stand where standing is required, even when the ground beneath my feet is cold and uncertain and very, very far from home. I am telling you this now because what happened to me in the autumn of 1887, in a mountain town in Colorado that most maps barely bothered to name, was the kind of thing that does not happen to women like me. Or so I believed for a very long time. I was wrong. But it took a forge, a stubborn man, and a piece of paper that almost destroyed everything for me to understand exactly how wrong I had been. Let me start at the beginning. Not the romantic beginning. The real one. I was born in County Clare, Ireland, in the spring of 1851, the eldest of 8 children, and the largest of all of them by the time I turned 12. My father, Seamus Fallon, was a blacksmith. His father before him had been a blacksmith, and his father before that. The forge was in our bones, the way the salt was in the coastal air around our village, constant and invisible, and completely impossible to separate from everything else that made us who we were. Da used to say that iron does not lie. You heat it, and it tells you what it is. You hammer it, and it tells you what it can become. You rush it, and it breaks. You respect it, and it holds. He said this so many times when I was a child that I stopped hearing it as wisdom and started hearing it as simply the texture of daily life, the way some families say grace before dinner and some families sing. We talked about iron. I learned the forge the way most children learn to read gradually and then all at once. At 8, I could manage the bellows. At 10, I could hold the tongs steady. At 12, I could feel the difference between iron that was ready and iron that needed another pass through the heat. Not because anyone taught me the specific sensation, but because I had been paying attention for 4 years, and my hands had quietly learned what my mind had not yet put into words. Da never made me feel strange for this. Da never looked at my broad shoulders or my large, capable hands and suggested that perhaps I should be learning embroidery instead. He just handed me a lighter hammer and told me to watch my thumb placement. The rest of our village was less straightforward about the matter. I understood early that there was a version of me that people were comfortable with, and there was the actual me, and these two things did not line up neatly. The comfortable version was a strong girl who helped her father in the forge because times were hard and there were mouths to feed and someone had to. That version was acceptable. Temporary. A practical solution to a practical problem. The actual version was a girl who loved the work, who felt something close to peace in the heat and noise of the forge that she felt nowhere else, who was genuinely good at it better than most men she watched, and who had no particular interest in pretending otherwise. That version made people uneasy in ways they could not always articulate, but expressed clearly enough through the particular kind of silence that falls when a girl walks into a room and the conversation shifts to something else. I am telling you this not for sympathy. I outgrew the need for sympathy about the same time I outgrew most of the furniture in our house. I am telling you this because it is the foundation of everything that followed. You cannot understand what happened on that Colorado mountain without understanding what I carried with me when I left Ireland, and not all of it was in my trunk. By the time I was 30 years old, I had become the kind of woman that a certain type of person calls impressive and means it as a very complicated sort of compliment. I had helped Da run the forge through 3 difficult winters. I had raised my younger siblings through illnesses and lean seasons. I had buried 2 of them, which is a grief I do not plan to revisit here, but which shaped the particular way I hold myself somewhat forward, somewhat braced, as if I have learned that the blow sometimes comes without warning, and the only response is to already be standing firm when it arrives. I had not married. This was not for lack of offers, exactly. There were men in our village and in the neighboring villages who looked at me and saw something worth having. But looking and choosing are different things, and the men who approached me tended to want a version of me that was slightly adjusted, a little less capable, a little more willing to defer, a little more comfortable with the arrangement where they were the strong one and I was something to be protected. I did not know how to be that. I tried once when I was 24 with a farmer's son from the next town over, who had warm eyes and a good laugh. We lasted 3 months before he told me kindly, and with genuine regret, that he could not spend his life feeling like the weaker party. I thought about that for a long time afterward. I still think about it sometimes. I was not angry at him. I was angry at the situation the way it seemed designed so that my particular shape of person would always be slightly too much of one thing and not quite enough of another. Then, Da got sick. It happened the way serious illnesses often do, not all at once, but in stages, each stage presenting itself as a temporary setback until the morning came when we both understood it was not temporary at all. He was 61 years old. He had been hammering iron since he was 9. His lungs, the doctor said, had been breathing forge smoke for over 50 years, and they had finally said enough. He lasted 8 months from the diagnosis. During those 8 months, I ran the forge alone. My brother Declan was 17 and willing, but not yet skilled enough to carry the main work, so I carried it. I filled the orders. I kept the customers. I made sure the forge did not go cold and the family did not go hungry, and Da could rest without worrying about whether there would be anything left to come back to. There was not, as it turned out, anything to come back to. Not for him. He died on a Tuesday in February, with the snow coming sideways off the Atlantic and the fire in the hearth low, and all 7 of his remaining children in the room. He held my hand at the end. He looked at my hands for a long time. His were larger still, even after the illness had taken so much of him, the hands of a man who had spent a lifetime in iron. He said very quietly, "Bridget Aline BH, you could run this forge better than I ever did." I said, "Then why does everyone act like it's something to apologize for, Da?" He did not answer. There was no answer, I think, that he knew how to give. He squeezed my hand once, and then he was gone, and I sat with that unanswered question, the way you sit with a coal that has fallen from the fire, carefully aware of the heat, not quite ready to pick it up, and not able to walk away from it either. The forge had to be sold. Da had debts that none of us had known the full weight of while he was alive, the kind of debts a proud man accumulates quietly over years of hard seasons and refuses to mention because mentioning them would mean admitting that the ground beneath the family is not as solid as everyone has been led to believe. The sale covered the debts and left enough to settle the younger children with relatives and give me passage money and a small amount to start with. I was 36 years old. I had excellent hands and a strong back and a very clear understanding of iron in all its forms, and I had no forge and no particular place that needed the combination of these things. I stood in the empty forge the week after Da died, and the week before the buyer came to take possession, and I looked at the cold hearth and the swept floor and the walls where the tools had hung for 60 years, and I asked myself the question I had been avoiding since the illness began. What does a woman like me do now? I did not find the answer in the empty forge. I found it absurdly on the notice board at St. Brendan's Church 3 weeks later, between an advertisement for a lost sheep and a notice about the repair of the village well. The advertisement was small and had been posted by a regional agency that matched men in the American frontier territories with women willing to relocate as wives. The language was formal and slightly awkward. It listed several men who had written requesting companions. One of them was from Colorado. He was a blacksmith. I read it 3 times. I am not a sentimental woman. I did not read it 3 times because I felt the hand of destiny in it. I read it 3 times because the first time I read it quickly and missed that he was a blacksmith, and the second time I read it carefully and noticed, and the third time I read it, I was arguing with myself about whether this was a reasonable idea or a desperate one. I concluded that it was possibly both, and that this did not necessarily make it wrong. The advertisement described him as Cormac Daly Blacksmith, situated in the Rocky Mountain Territory of Colorado, a widower of 4 years seeking a companion. The agency's description of his request was careful and specific. He sought, and I will give you the exact language, because it matters, a delicate, gentle lady from back east who can keep a warm home. I sat in the church pew for a long time after reading that. I am not from back east. I am from the westernmost edge of Ireland, which is about as far east as the moon from where he was sitting. I am not delicate. I have never been delicate. I am not gentle in the way that word is usually meant, the soft and yielding and quiet kind of gentle. I can be gentle with animals and with people who are hurting, and with iron that is at the right temperature for working, but that is a different kind of gentle entirely. And yet, he was a blacksmith, a man who worked iron 6 days a week and understood what that life was. A man who lived on a mountain and presumably needed someone capable, someone who could handle what a mountain produces in the way of cold and difficulty and unexpected situations requiring immediate practical action. It seemed to me that what he had written in that advertisement and what he actually needed might be two different things, and it seemed to me, with the particular stubbornness that has always been both my greatest problem and my most useful quality, that I was in a position to know the difference. I wrote him a letter. It was honest. It did not mention my hands. His response came 6 weeks later. 11 lines. The handwriting moved carefully across the page, each letter placed with the deliberateness of a man more comfortable with a hammer than a pen. He said the mountain was hard. He said the winters were long. He said he needed someone who could keep the hearth and mend what broke. He said the forge was his father's before him, and he intended it to remain standing. He did not say he was lonely, but 11 lines from a man who lived alone at altitude in the Rocky Mountains told me everything the words were not saying. I had spent enough years paying attention to iron to know how to read what was underneath the surface. I booked my passage. I want to tell you about the crossing, because it matters not for the obvious reasons, but for one specific reason that took me a long time to understand, was significant. The ship was a working vessel, not a passenger liner in the elegant sense. The crossing from Cove to New York took the better part of 6 weeks, depending on the weather, and the weather that autumn was uncertain in the way that the Atlantic is always uncertain, with no particular malice, but no particular sympathy either. I had a small cabin that was cold and damp and adequate, and I spent most of my days on deck because the open air was better for my thinking, and because I had always found enclosed spaces difficult when I had a great deal on my mind. I helped where I could on the ship, not to be impressive, simply because there was work to be done and I was capable of doing it, and standing by watching things that needed doing when you have the capacity to assist has always seemed to me a particular form of laziness I have never been able to manage. The crew accepted this with the pragmatic gratitude of working men who have learned not to question useful help when it appears. It was during one of these afternoons, helping secure a load of cargo that had shifted in rough weather, that I first saw her. She was standing near the railing on the upper deck, watching me with an expression that was not the usual mixture of surprise and mild condescension I was accustomed to receiving from women of her obvious social station. She was beautifully dressed in the way that speaks of money without quite shouting it: dark wool, good buttons, a hat that was practical enough to suggest she had been traveling before. She looked to be perhaps 40, though it was difficult to say with certainty. She had the kind of face that keeps its own counsel. What she was watching me with was not condescension. It was something closer to recognition. She found me later when the work was done and I was washing my hands at the deck pump. She came and stood beside me with the directness of a woman who has decided to do something and is not planning to spend time on preamble. She said, "You do that like you have done it before." I said I do most things like I have done them before. She smiled. Not the polite kind. The real kind, the kind that reaches the eyes before it reaches the mouth. Her name was May. She was returning to Colorado from a visit to relatives in Boston. She was married, she said in the tone of voice that people use when they are providing a fact rather than sharing a pleasure. Her husband had interests in several towns along the mountain territory. She had been east for a month and was going back because that was where her life was, and that sentence contained within it a weight that I recognized without being able to immediately name. We sat together that evening on a bench near the stern with the wind cold and the sky going dark over the water and the lights of the ship making a small warm island in the surrounding ocean. We talked the way people sometimes talk when they are temporarily suspended between the life they have left and the life they are going toward more honestly than geography usually permits. She asked me where I was headed, I told her, Colorado, to marry a man I had never met. She asked if that was frightening. I thought about it for a genuine moment before answering, which I think she appreciated. I said, less frightening than staying somewhere that already knows exactly what to think of you. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, my husband knows exactly what to think of me too. That is not always a comfort. I looked at her. She was looking out at the water, her profile very still, and there was something in her expression that I understood in my body before my mind caught up with it. The exhaustion of being seen a particular way and having no recourse. The particular loneliness of being defined so completely by someone else's vision of you that you have begun to lose track of your own. I knew that feeling. I had felt it in a different key for most of my life. Too much instead of too little, but the essential experience of not fitting the shape that had been prepared for you, that was something I recognized completely. I said, I think they might be the same thing, being tired and being brave. Sometimes you get there by the same road. She looked at me then, and she nodded slowly, the way people nod when something has been said that they needed to hear and did not expect to hear on a boat in the middle of the Atlantic from a woman with calloused hands and Irish vowels. I did not know her last name yet. I would not know it until I arrived in Colorado and understood with a cold jolt of recognition exactly who her husband was. But that is the part of the story that comes later. For now, understand only this. I crossed an ocean with a trunk full of practical things and a mending kit and a small piece of iron I had taken from my father's forge, the last piece he had worked before he became too ill to work. I was 36 years old. I had never been to America. I did not know what I was going to find at the other end of a train journey through landscapes that grew increasingly vast and unfamiliar, until the mountains appeared on the horizon, and my heart did something unexpected at the sight of them. I had asked for somewhere that did not already know what to think of me. I was about to arrive at exactly that place. I just did not know yet that the mountain already had its own opinions. The train from Denver to the mountain territory took the better part of a day and a half, with 2 stops at towns that were more intention than completion. The kind of places that have a post office and a hardware store, and the ambition of becoming something larger still in negotiation with the geography around them. I watched the landscape change through the window. I had grown up near the sea, which is its own kind of vastness. But the sea moves and changes, and the horizon over water has a quality of suggestion, as if something might appear at any moment from beyond it. The mountains were different. They were completely and utterly certain of themselves. They did not suggest. They declared. They had been declaring for longer than any human concern, and they planned to continue doing so indefinitely. And if you found this unsettling, that was your particular problem to resolve. I found it unexpectedly comforting. The final leg of the journey was by wagon from a small depot town, driven by a man named Herschel, who had a weathered face and said nothing the entire journey. I respected him immediately. He asked me twice if I needed help with my trunk, and when I declined both times, he nodded and gave the horses his full attention for the rest of the journey, which I found to be exactly the right response. The town we arrived at was called Denton Falls, though the only falls in the vicinity were a modest series of rocks, over which a cold creek descended about 40 yards south of the main street. The main street itself had the compressed, purposeful quality of frontier settlements, every building earning its space, nothing decorative that could not also be functional. A general store, a post office, a doctor's office with a hand-painted sign, a boarding house, a livery stable, and at the far end, set back from the street on a slight rise, a structure somewhat larger than the others, from whose chimney a thin thread of smoke rose straight up in the still autumn air. The forge. I saw it before I saw anything else. I had expected to feel something practical about it, assessment evaluation, the habitual sizing up of a working space that had been second nature to me since childhood. I felt something else instead, something that I would have called recognition if that word did not imply a prior acquaintance. It was more like the feeling of arriving at a place you have seen in a dream, the certain knowledge that you have been here before, in some way that does not have a precise explanation. I put the feeling away. There were more immediate matters. The wagon stopped in the center of the main street. I became aware of the people on both sides of it, with the particular acute awareness of a person who has just become the center of an attention she did not request. They were not unfriendly exactly. They were curious in the uncomplicated way of small communities where events are few and arrivals are therefore notable. Women with children. Men who had found reasons to be near the street at this particular moment. A man leaning in the doorway of the general store with his arms crossed and an expression of mild amusement that suggested he had seen this kind of thing before and found it reliably entertaining, and one man who was not amused and was not curious in the easy general way of the others. He stood slightly apart from the crowd at the edge of the street nearest the forge. He was perhaps 55, well dressed for the location, in a dark coat, with good buttons and boots that had been recently cleaned. He had a round, pleasant face that would have been genuinely pleasant if not for the eyes, which were the eyes of a man engaged in a constant quiet transaction with his surroundings. Everything he looked at, he seemed to be calculating its value and considering his options. He was looking at me the way he looked at everything else. I noted him and moved on because Herschel had climbed down from the wagon and someone had to deal with the trunk. I dealt with the trunk. The crowd's collective intake of breath at this was audible, and I chose not to find it interesting. I had been causing that particular intake of breath since I was 15 years old and had long since decided that the appropriate response was simply to continue doing the thing that caused it and let people adjust at their own pace. The man with the calculating eyes did not intake his breath. He watched without expression, and then he looked away in the direction of the forge on the rise, and something shifted in his face. Something tightened. It was so brief I might have imagined it. I did not think I had imagined it. And then I saw Cormac Daly. He was standing perhaps 30 feet away, which meant he had been there for some time without me seeing him, which said something about the kind of man he was. He was not the kind of man who positions himself to be seen. He was the kind of man who finds a place to stand and stands there and lets events come to him not from passivity, but from a settled quality that is different from passivity in the same way that iron is different from lead. Both are heavy. Only one has the capacity to become something under sufficient heat. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the specific way of men who have been doing heavy physical work since adolescence, not the cultivated breadth of someone who has worked at it, but the functional breadth of someone who simply had no choice. He had dark hair, going gray at the temples, and a face that had been weathered by altitude and cold into something that had given up the smooth uncertainties of youth for a more angular, definite quality. He was in the most straightforward possible sense a man who had arrived at himself through a great deal of difficulty. He was holding a piece of paper. My letter, I realized. He was holding my letter. His hands were not shaking, but his jaw was tight in the way of a man who is maintaining composure through the deliberate application of will, which is a different thing from composure itself and takes considerably more energy. He had expected someone else. That was completely clear. He had read my letter, which I had been as honest as I knew how to be in writing, and he had still expected someone else, because the truth is that people read what they expect to read and fill in the rest with what they hope to find, and he had been hoping to find something that I was simply not. I walked toward him. The crowd, I was dimly aware, had arranged itself in the way of crowds at significant moments not consciously choreographed, but collectively gravitating toward a good view of whatever was about to happen. I stopped in front of Cormac Daly. He looked at me. I looked at him. I will tell you what I saw in his face, because I want to be accurate about it. I have heard stories like this told where the man sees the woman who is not what he expected, and his face shows shock or comedy or the particular slapstick surprise of someone whose assumptions have just been physically contradicted. That is not what I saw. What I saw was more complicated and more honest than that. What I saw was a man looking at a situation that had just become significantly harder than he had prepared himself for, and working through the calculation of how to respond to that with something resembling dignity. I respected that. It was, in fact, the first thing about him I actively respected. He said, "Miss Fallon." I said, "Mr. Daly." We looked at each other for a moment that was longer than a greeting and shorter than a conversation. He said, "You are not what I was expecting." I said, I know. Do you want me to get back on the wagon? It was not a rhetorical question. I meant it genuinely. If he looked at me standing in front of his forge in his mountain town and felt that the gap between what he had asked for and what he had received was simply too large to bridge. I wanted to know that now rather than later. I had not come this far to be anyone's disappointment. I had come this far because I thought there might be a place that needed what I actually was, and if this was not that place, I needed to know immediately. He did not answer right away. He looked down instead, which I might have taken for dismissal, except that I realized he was looking at my hands. My hands were at my sides, not displayed, not concealed, simply present in the way that hands are present when they are not actively doing anything. They were what they were, large, calloused, scarred in the specific places where sparks and hot metal leave their permanent record, the hands of someone who had been working iron since childhood. He looked at them for what felt like a long time, but was probably 3 seconds. Then he looked back up at me and said, "No, ma'am. You made a long trip. Come eat something." He turned and started walking toward the wagon without flourish or elaboration, and I stood for a moment and looked at his back, and then I followed him because there was nothing else to do, and because something in the plainness of that invitation, the complete lack of performance in it, had told me something. I was not sure yet what it had told me, but I was paying attention. The journey to the cabin took most of an hour over a road that was in the transitional stage between a path and an actual road, and had not fully committed to either identity. The mountains were very close here, not the distant, dramatic backdrop they had been from the train, but genuinely, immediately present the kind of close that reminds you that you are a small thing in a large arrangement that has been in place for a very long time and is not particularly focused on your concerns. Cormac drove without speaking. I sat beside him and looked at the landscape and was grateful for the silence because I needed to think, and thinking is something I have always done better without the distraction of required social response. The wagon hit a deep rut in the road and lurched. I braced automatically, one hand on the side rail, and then I noticed him glance at me when the lurch was over. Not with surprise, with the careful, steady attention of someone cataloging information without committing to interpretation yet. We went around a bend and came to a stop where a stretch of mud from yesterday's rain had made the road soft, and the back wheel was threatening to settle into it past the point of easy retrieval. Before Cormac had completed the motion of setting down the reins, I was already on the ground behind the wagon. I said, "Go." There was a pause. Then the reins snapped and the horses pulled, and I put my hands flat against the back of the wagon and pushed the weight of it familiar in my shoulders, the angle of the effort something my body knew from 100 similar moments with 100 similarly stuck things. The wheel came free. The wagon moved forward. I climbed back up. He did not say thank you. But when I settled back into the seat beside him, he shifted slightly to the left, making perhaps 3 inches of additional room that had not been made available before. In a man of his particular kind, I understood this as the equivalent of a fairly significant gesture. I did not smile at it, but I filed it carefully. The cabin was on the south side of a hill set against the tree line with a clear view east down the valley. It was solidly built, the kind of construction that prioritized function over any aesthetic consideration, but had achieved a certain rugged dignity through sheer quality of workmanship. The logs were tight and well chinked. The roof was sound. The porch had been reinforced relatively recently with new timber that was a slightly different color than the original, and 40 yards up the rise, connected to the main structure by a covered walkway, was the forge. I could see it from the wagon. I could smell it before I saw it. The particular complex smell of coal and iron and residual heat and old metal and a dozen accumulated years of working fire, and something in my chest did the thing it had done when the train came around the bend and the Rockies appeared on the horizon. Something settled. Something that had been braced for a long time allowed itself provisionally to consider the possibility of setting down. This was a forge. This was what I knew. Everything else was uncertain. He was uncertain. The situation was uncertain. The future in this place, in this entirely unfamiliar arrangement, was deeply and comprehensively uncertain. But the forge was what I knew. I got down from the wagon. I did not go into the forge that evening. I understood, without needing to think about it carefully, that some things needed to wait for the right moment, and arriving at a man's forge the first hour I was at his property was not the right moment. There were forms to be observed, not because I cared about forms for their own sake, but because I understood that he needed time to adjust, and that pushing too quickly into his space before he had done any adjusting would be the wrong kind of wrong. We ate supper at a table that was large enough for 4 people and had clearly been sized for a life that no longer matched its current population. There was venison stew and bread that he had made himself denser than ideal, but structurally sound and honestly prepared, and we ate mostly without talking, which suited me fine. He was watching me in the way that people watch things when they are trying to decide what category to put them in and are frustrated by the absence of an obvious answer. I let him watch. I was watching him too, in the less obvious way I have developed over years of needing to assess situations accurately without appearing to do so. What I saw was a man who had been alone long enough that the aloneness had settled into him and become structural part of the load-bearing architecture of how he moved through his days. He was not unfriendly. He was careful. He was the kind of careful that comes from loss, from having been open and having had the open places hurt in ways that did not fully heal, and the carefulness was the response to that, not malice and not weakness, but a reasonable adaptation to a painful set of data points. He had lost his wife. He had said this in his letter without elaborating 4 years ago, and the absence of elaboration had told me almost as much as elaboration would have. After supper, he said he needed to check on the horses and went outside, and a few minutes later, there was a knock at the door and an old man came in without waiting for an answer, which suggested he was the kind of person who had long since established the right to do so. He was small and lean, with a face like weathered bark, and eyes that were sharp as a forge nail and missing nothing. He introduced himself as Doc Abernathy, which I understood to mean he was the doctor for the area, though he carried it lightly the way of a man who has been many things over a long life and holds his titles without attachment. He sat down across from me at the table and looked at me with the direct, unceremonious attention of someone who has no time for preamble and no patience for indirection. He said, "I'll be plain with you, Miss Fallon, because I suspect you prefer it." I said, "You suspect correctly." He told me about Earl Hutchins. He told me about the debt note. He told me about the 60 days. He told me about the land and the railroad that was being routed through the valley, and what that made the property worth, and what that meant about why Earl Hutchins was so interested in collecting a debt that he might otherwise have been content to let rest. He told me that a married man with an established homestead had legal standing in the territory, that a widower alone did not, and that Earl was aware of this, and that the timing of Earl's pressure on the debt note was not coincidental. I listened to all of this without interrupting. When he had finished, I said, "How much time?" He said, 60 days, give or take, before Earl can move to call the note. I said, "And a married man has more legal standing than a widower." He looked at me with those nail-sharp eyes and said, "You understood that faster than most." I said I understood it from the beginning. I just needed someone to confirm I had read it correctly. I looked out the window at the dark. I could see the forge on the rise, silhouetted against the lighter dark of the sky, its chimney cold and still for the evening. There were things happening in my chest that I am not going to try to describe with too much precision, because precision would make them smaller than they were. I had seen a forge sold from underneath a family because the money was not there to save it. I had stood in my father's empty forge after the sale and felt the specific quality of that particular kind of loss, the loss of a place that was also a purpose, a history, a way of being in the world. It was a loss that did not have a clean shape. It spread. I thought about that. And I thought about the 11 lines in careful handwriting that had found their way to a church notice board in County Clare and ended up here at this table, in this mountain, 60 days from one kind of disaster or another. I thought about May on the ship saying that she knew exactly what her husband thought of her and that it was not a comfort. And I thought about what I had said to her in return, that staying somewhere that already knows what to think of you is its own kind of frightening. I had meant it when I said it. I still meant it now, sitting at a dead man's table in a house on a Colorado mountain next to a cold forge that was going to be taken from a grieving man by a calculating one, unless something changed. Doc Abernathy was watching me think. He said, "It's a complicated thing you've walked into, Miss Fallon." I said, "Most things worth doing are." He looked at me for a moment, and then he did something unexpected. He smiled. Not the careful, measuring smile of a man assessing a situation. The real kind. The kind that means something. He said, "I think Cormac may have gotten more than he asked for." I said, "He asked for delicate and gentle." He got me. That is a factual statement. Doc said, "Sometimes the thing you ask for and the thing you need are two different items entirely. The prairie has a way of knowing the difference." I looked at him. I said, "I am not sure I believe in the prairie having opinions, Doc." He said, "Give it time." He left shortly after pausing in the doorway to put on his coat, and through the window, I watched him make his way down the hill toward town, a small figure in the large dark of the mountain evening, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who has made this walk many times and intends to make it many more. Cormac came back in from the horses. He stood by the door for a moment without sitting down, and I understood that he was deciding something, the particular quality of stillness that belongs to a person at the edge of a decision. He said Doc comes by a lot. I said, "He seems like a good man." Cormac said he is. He was with Clara at the end. He said this in the same tone he might have used to say that Doc had been at the forge last Thursday to pick up a repaired hinge. Flat and careful, and containing underneath the flatness something that was neither of those things. Clara. His wife. The word in his mouth was 4 years of practice at saying it without flinching. I said, "I'm sorry for your loss." He said, 4 years ago now. As if 4 years was a significant quantity of time. As if 4 years was the kind of time that was supposed to have resolved something. I did not say anything else about it. I was not yet in a position to say the things I was thinking, which were not comfortable thoughts, but were probably true. I stored them carefully the way you store iron that is not yet at temperature, patient, knowing the moment will come. He said good night shortly after, and I sat alone at the table for a while after his door closed, listening to the mountain outside, which made sounds I was not yet fluent in wind through a different kind of tree than I was accustomed to some animal in the middle distance, making its own quiet accounting of the evening, the creek somewhere lower on the hill running over its stones. I opened my trunk before I went to bed and found what I was looking for near the bottom, wrapped in cloth. A piece of iron, roughly rectangular, the last piece my father had worked before his hands gave out. I had taken it from the forge the day before. The sail tucked it under my coat, with the directness of someone who has decided not to examine the impulse too carefully. I set it on the windowsill where I would be able to see it from the bed. Then I lay down in the dark of a mountain I did not know yet, in a house belonging to a man I had only just met, in a country that was not my country, 60 days from one kind of disaster and an unknown distance from everything else, and I thought about iron. Iron does not lie. You heat it and it tells you what it is. Something was being heated here. In this house, on this hill, in the arrangement that had begun today, with a man looking at my hands and deciding not to put me back on the wagon. Something was in the fire and beginning to show what it was made of, and I did not know yet what it would become under the hammer. But I knew the fire. I had known the fire my whole life, and I was not afraid of what it might make. I fell asleep to the sound of the mountain wind and the creek, and if I dreamed, I did not remember the dreams. But when I woke in the early cold of the mountain morning before the light was fully committed to the sky, my first thought was of the forge on the rise and the cold hearth that was waiting to be lit. And my second thought was that somewhere in that house, a stubborn, grief-carrying, careful man was also lying in the early cold of the morning, also awake, also thinking about things he did not have words for yet, and neither of us was quite as alone as we had been the day before. That was not nothing. In fact, looking back now from the other side of everything that happened, I think it was very nearly everything. I was in the forge before sunrise. I want to be clear about why, because the reason matters. It was not to make a point. It was not to demonstrate anything to anyone, least of all to Cormac Daly, who was still behind his closed door when I laced my boots and stepped out into the pre-dawn cold of the mountain. It was because I had been waking before sunrise my entire life, and because the forge was there on the rise against the dark sky, and because I had been away from a working forge for the better part of 4 months, and something in me was simply done waiting. The covered walkway between the cabin and the forge was perhaps 20 yards roofed with timber and open on the sides to the mountain air. My breath made small clouds as I walked it. The ground was hard with the cold that settles in at altitude in October, a different cold than Ireland's drier and more direct without the damp weight of Atlantic air behind it. It was a cold that was honest about what it was. I found I could respect that. The forge door was on a heavy iron hinge of Cormac's own making. I could see the quality of the work immediately, the proportions correct, the fit precise, the kind of hinge that would outlast the door it served. I lifted the latch and went in. The smell hit me first. Coal and iron and residual heat, and the particular mineral sharpness of a working forge that has been burning for years, the accumulated breath of 1,000 fires soaked into the stone and timber of the walls. It was different from my father's forge in its specific details. A different blend, a different weight of smoke in the air. But underneath the differences, it was unmistakably the same essential thing. The smell of a place where metal was made honest. I stood for a moment and let my eyes adjust. The forge was well organized in the way of a man who works alone and has developed his systems through years of practical necessity rather than instruction. Everything had a place, and everything was in it, not because of any particular tidiness of personality, but because a working forge, where tools are misplaced, is a forge where time is wasted, and time in a one-man operation on a mountain is a resource without surplus. The tools hung on the north wall in order of size and frequency of use. The coal was stored in a bin to the left of the hearth, close enough for easy access, but not so close as to be a hazard. The water trough for quenching was positioned at the right distance from the anvil, for a right-handed man working alone. The anvil itself was old. Older than the forge, I thought possibly older than the territory. It had been struck 10,000 times at least, and it showed not in damage, but in the opposite of damage, a surface compressed and darkened by decades of honest use, the iron itself made denser by everything it had absorbed. It was a good anvil. The kind of anvil that becomes almost a collaborator over years of work that a man learns the personality of and adjusts his approach to account for. I touched it. I do not entirely know why. It was cold under my hand. Cold the way deep iron is always cold until the work begins. And I stood, with my palm flat on its surface for a moment, and felt the accumulated weight of all the work it had absorbed, all the iron it had shaped all the mornings, just like this one, when someone had come in before the light and begun. I began to understand the forge the way I had described it to myself the night before, slowly, by paying attention. I checked the bellows for condition and found them sound, recently repaired at the nozzle with leather that still had good flexibility. I looked at the coal and assessed the grade. I examined the tongs and hammers one by one, lifting each, feeling the balance, noting which were Cormac's preferences by the wear patterns on the handles and the particular polish that comes from regular contact with the same set of hands. His main hammer was heavier than my father's had been, heavier than I would have chosen for myself. But it was balanced correctly for its weight, and when I lifted it and felt the distribution of it in my hand, I understood something about how he worked the particular rhythm that a hammer, this weight imposes slower and more deliberate than a lighter tool, each blow having to count for more, because there is a longer interval between blows. It was the hammer of a patient man, a man who had learned not to rush. I set it down carefully in exactly the position I had found it. That was when I heard him. Not footsteps exactly. More the slight change in the quality of the air that tells you a door has opened somewhere, a shift in the draft that a building produces when it is no longer fully enclosed. I did not turn around immediately. I was looking at the far corner of the forge where a partially completed piece of work was held in a vise, a bracket of some kind, the iron bent and fitted with a precision that spoke well of the man who had been working it. He said, "You know forges." I said my father's, since I was 8. I heard him come in, then his boots on the stone floor, and I turned to find him standing inside the door with his coat on and his breath making the same small clouds mine had made on the walkway. He was looking at me in the way he had looked at me from the moment I arrived, the careful cataloging look that committed to nothing but missed nothing either. He did not look surprised to find me there. He did not look pleased or displeased. He looked like a man who had filed a piece of information and was now incorporating it into a calculation that was ongoing. He walked to his position at the anvil, the way a man walks to a place he has walked to 10,000 times before without thinking about the path, his body simply knowing where it is going. He picked up his hammer. He looked at me once more, a brief direct look that asked without words whether I intended to stay or go. I stayed. He lit the forge. We worked for the better part of 2 hours without exchanging more than perhaps 15 words. He worked the bracket he had left in the vise, bringing it to temperature and refining the fit of the bend with a methodical patience that was satisfying to watch each blow placed with the deliberateness that his heavy hammer required. I found tasks at the periphery that needed doing, things that any experienced forge hand would identify without being told, a tool that needed the edge-dressed leather on a set of bellows handles that had dried and needed oiling, a corner of the coal bin that had developed an obstruction affecting the flow. I did these things without comment or announcement. I did them because they needed doing, and I was capable of doing them. At some point, the sun had fully committed to the sky outside, and the light through the forge's high windows changed from gray to something warmer, and I became aware that we had established a rhythm without having discussed establishing one. His work at the center of the forge, my work at its margins, the movements and sounds of each not interfering with, but rather accommodating the other, the way two currents of water in the same channel will sometimes find a way to flow alongside each other without the turbulence you might expect from the proximity. He set his hammer down and looked at the finished bracket. Then he looked at me. He said, "You dress tools like that at home." I said, "At home, we kept everything sharp." My father said, "A dull tool is an argument with the work." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father said the same thing. Different words, same meaning." That was all. He picked up the bracket and took it to the cooling rack, and we went back to our respective occupations. But something had shifted in the temperature of the room, not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself. Just slightly warmer than it had been before those 3 sentences. I filed this alongside the 3 inches of space on the wagon seat. I was building a picture of Cormac daily from these small pieces, because the small pieces were what was available, and I had always believed that a picture built from small true pieces is more reliable than a large image assembled from assumptions. His father had been a blacksmith too, or at least a man who thought about tools and work in ways consistent with the trade. The forge had come down to him as my father's forge had come down to me, through the work of my hands, if not the deed of the property. He was patient in his work, in a way that suggested it was not natural patience, but developed patience, the kind you build deliberately over time when you have understood that impatience costs you more than it gains. And he was alone in a way that had become structural. I had thought this the night before, and the morning confirmed it. The forge was perfectly organized for one person. Every system, every positioning of tools and materials, every workflow embedded in the layout of the space. It was the design of a life that had been adjusted over 4 years to function without a second set of hands. There was an efficiency to it that was also, if you looked carefully, a kind of sorrow. The efficiency of a man who has stopped expecting help and built his world accordingly. He did not know yet what to do with a second set of hands. I was going to give him time to figure it out, but not unlimited time. We had 60 days. It was on the 3rd day that Earl Hutchins came to the forge. I want to tell you about Earl carefully, because I think it matters to understand him accurately. He was not a simple villain. Simple villains are easier to deal with than the kind Earl was, because simple villains announce themselves through their manner, and you know immediately what you are working with. Earl Hutchins was the more difficult kind of man whose villainy was entirely practical and conducted in a register of perfect social smoothness. He did not seem to want anything unreasonable. He did not seem to mean anyone harm. He presented himself as a man of business engaged in the entirely legitimate exercise of his legitimate interests. And if those interests happened to coincide with the destruction of someone else's life, well, that was simply the nature of business, and anyone who disagreed was failing to understand the rules of the arrangement. He came in the late morning when the forge was warm and Cormac was in the middle of a commission, a set of decorative hinges for the new boarding house that required careful, sustained attention. Earl walked in as though he had come to the right place and knew it, which was the kind of entrance that is technically correct and somehow still a trespass. He was carrying a bottle of whiskey that he set on the workbench near the door as if depositing a gift, which it was not. It was a prop, something to make the visit look social when it was not that either. He said, "Cormac, good to see you working. Always good to see a man working." Cormac did not look up from the hinge he was working. He said, "Earl." Earl looked around the forge with the leisurely interest of a man doing a property assessment in the guise of friendly curiosity, which is exactly what it was. His eyes moved over the tools, the coal supply, the condition of the bellows, and the anvil, and the ceiling timbers, and I watched him do this from my position near the grinding wheel, where I had been dressing a draw knife, and I understood that what I was watching was a man pricing things. Then he looked at me. His expression did not change. This itself was informative because most people's expressions change when they see me for the first time in a working context, even if only slightly, even if only for a fraction of a second. Earl's did not. He had seen me arrive in town 3 days earlier and had already completed his assessment and incorporated the result, and now he was simply confirming what he already knew. He said, "You must be the young lady from Ireland. Welcome to Denton Falls." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Quite a journey from County Clare. Cormac tells me your father was in the trade." I said, "He was." Earl nodded with the warmth of a man who finds everything mildly interesting and nothing actually important. Then he looked back at Cormac. He said, "I just wanted to stop in and remind you neighborly-like that we're coming up on the end of the month. I know you haven't forgotten. I just think it's good to keep these things front of mind. You know how time moves up here in the mountains." Cormac set his hammer down. He looked at Earl with a steadiness that I recognize now as something he had developed specifically for Earl Hutchins, a particular variety of steady that contained just beneath its surface a very controlled and long-standing anger. He said, "I haven't forgotten, Earl. I don't need reminding." Earl smiled. He said, "Of course not. I never thought you did." He picked up the whiskey bottle from the workbench, reconsidered, set it back down. "Just a gesture," he said. "We're neighbors. I want this all resolved cleanly. You know that." He turned to go. At the door, he paused, which I had the sense was a practiced pause. The timing of a man who has learned that the exit is often more important than the entrance. He said without turning back, "It's good you've got company now, Cormac. Mountain winters can be hard on a man alone." He left. In the silence after him, the forge felt different. Not colder exactly, but more aware of its own temperature, the way a room feels after a door has been opened to the outside and closed again. Cormac picked up his hammer. I said, "How much does he want?" Cormac's hand tightened on the hammer handle. He said, $900, by end of month. I said, "Do you have it?" He said, "No." I said, "Do you have what you actually owe?" He put the hammer down again and looked at me. This was the first time since my arrival that he looked at me with something that was not the cataloging look. This was sharper and more direct, the look of a man who has just been asked a question he was not expecting and is trying to understand how the person asking it knew to ask it. He said, "What do you mean by that?" I said, "I mean that a man like Earl Hutchins does not visit a forge with a bottle of whiskey to collect a fair debt. He visits to remind you that he has something over you. And men who have fair things over people generally do not need to remind them." Cormac looked at me for a long moment. He said, "Doc talked to you." I said Doc confirmed what I had already read in the room when Earl Hutchins walked into it. Another long moment. The fire in the forge crackled and settled. He said, "The original note was $400. My father borrowed it in '79 for materials. He paid most of it back. What remained, when he died, was closer to 200. Earl came to me the spring after Clara passed with a document showing 900 compound interest going back to the beginning. I said, "And you signed it?" He said I was not in a condition to read carefully that spring. He said this with no self-pity and no apology. He said it the way you state a fact that is simply true, and which you have finished being ashamed of, because the shame has become too expensive to continue carrying. I understood that completely. I said, "Is there a copy of the original note?" He said, "My father kept his papers in a box under the floor." I went through it, after Clara. I found what I thought was the note, but it was only a partial page, not enough to stand against Earl's document in any legal setting. "I've looked for the rest of it. I haven't found it." I said, "Then we need to find it, or find something else." He said, "We." I said, "We." He looked at me for the third time with that sharper, more direct look. Something moved in his face that I could not fully read yet. Something complicated that involved more than the immediate situation. Then he picked up his hammer and went back to the hinge, and I went back to the draw knife, and we worked in silence for the rest of the morning. But it was a different silence than the one before Earl came. This one had something in it. Something unresolved that was also in a different light. Something beginning. The week that followed had its own rhythm, imperfect, and sometimes uncomfortable, and occasionally almost something else. We worked the forge together in the mornings. Cormac had a commission from the lumber operation east of town, a set of rigging hooks for their timber-moving equipment, large work requiring sustained heat, and precise forming, the kind of commission that stretched a one-man operation and that two sets of hands made significantly more manageable. He did not offer me the work explicitly. He simply began laying out the materials for it one morning, and when I moved to the second set of tongs without being asked, he adjusted his position at the anvil to account for the collaboration without comment. It was, I thought, the most honest partnership discussion I had ever participated in. In the evenings, we ate together and talked in the tentative, careful way of two people who are aware that they are building something, but are not yet sure of the load-bearing properties of the materials. He told me about the lumber operation and the men who ran it. He told me about the winter that was coming and what it would require. He told me once about the first winter after Clara, briefly and factually, and with the particular precision of a man who has learned to talk about a thing only as far as is necessary to acknowledge it without opening too much. I told him about Ireland, about the crossing, about the 7 younger siblings scattered now among relatives along the Clare coast, about my father in the careful, selected way that grief teaches you to talk about the people you have lost, the safe stories, first the ones that don't pull the floor out from under you. I did not tell him yet about the piece of iron on my windowsill. That was still mine. What I was watching throughout all of this was his grief. Not intrusively. Not with any intent to comment on it or fix it, because grief is not a broken hinge and does not submit to the same methodology. I was watching it the way you watch a fire that has been burning a long time, with the patient interest of someone who knows that fires reveal their nature over time, if you pay attention without interfering. What I saw was a man who had organized his entire life around the management of a loss he did not know how to resolve. The cabin was clean and functional and completely without any evidence of the life that had been in it before Clara died. Not because he had eradicated that life deliberately, but because he had gradually, over 4 years, replaced everything that had belonged to it with the functional objects of his solitary existence, and what was left was a space that was in every practical way adequate and in every other way completely empty. Except for one thing. In the corner of the main room, on a hook behind the door, where it was not immediately visible when you entered, there was a woman's dress. Dark blue wool, the kind of dress a woman wears for practical daily work, not for occasions. It had been hanging there long enough that the color had faded slightly at the shoulder, where the light sometimes reached it. It was not displayed. It was not prominently positioned. It was simply there on its hook in the corner behind the door, where it had apparently been since a day 4 years ago when someone had put it there, and no one had moved it since. I noticed it on my 3rd day. I did not mention it. I mention it now because it is the key to understanding everything that happened the following week when I found the letter. I was looking for a length of wire I had seen in the back of the storage shelf, a particular gauge suitable for a small repair I was making to a tool roll, and in moving things on the shelf, I dislodged a box that had been pushed to the back and forgotten. It was a plain wooden box, not large, and when it fell, the lid came open and the papers inside scattered. I gathered them. I was not reading them deliberately. I was simply collecting what had fallen and replacing it in the box, the automatic courtesy of a person who has come across someone else's private things and wants to restore the situation as quickly as possible. But one page lay face up on the shelf, and I could not help seeing what was on it because it was directly in my line of sight. It was a letter. In Cormac's handwriting, careful and deliberate, addressed to the agency. A draft, not the final version, but complete enough that there was no question of what it said. I am seeking a delicate, gentle lady from back east. Someone accustomed to quieter ways. Someone soft-spoken and patient. I do not require much, only a warm presence in a cold place and a steady hand to keep things in order. I am a plain man who has had his share of difficulty. I am looking for ease, I suppose. The kind of ease that comes from someone who fits the shape of what I have been missing. I set it back in the box. I replaced the box on the shelf. I found the wire I needed and went back to what I was doing. But I carried that letter with me through the rest of the afternoon, the way you carry something sharp in a coat pocket, constantly aware of it, constantly adjusting your movement to account for its presence. Delicate, gentle, soft-spoken. Someone who fits the shape of what I have been missing. I had heard those words or their equivalents my entire life arranged as a description of the thing I was not. And here they were again, in the handwriting of the man I was now sharing meals with, whose forge I worked alongside each morning, who had looked at my hands and not put me back on the wagon. He had written those words and meant them. He had wanted that woman. He had sent for her. And he had received instead a 36-year-old Irish blacksmith's daughter, with hands like forge tools and a strong opinions about the proper maintenance of bellows leather. I did not cry about this. I want to be clear about that. I am not a woman who cries easily, and when I do, it is not about things like this, about being the wrong shape for someone else's need. I had cried when my father died, and when my youngest brother Colum died of the fever at age 9, and at 2 or 3 other moments, where the grief was simply too large to be managed any other way. I did not cry about the letter, but I felt it. I felt it in the specific place where women like me have learned to feel these things, the place that has been over the years bruised into a particular kind of tenderness by repeated contact with the same variety of disappointment. The message delivered again that the correct version of a woman in this world is the other kind, the quiet kind, the kind that fits the shape that has already been decided upon. I felt it, and then I did what I have always done, with feelings that cannot be immediately resolved. I put them somewhere interior and structural, built them into the load-bearing architecture of my daily functioning, and got on with the work. But I did not forget the letter. I was still carrying it in that interior way on the evening 3 days later, when Cormac set a small basket of wood on the kitchen table. A small basket, half the size of the one I had been bringing in from the woodpile, left there without comment, as if it had always been that size, as if reducing it were simply a thing that had been decided. I looked at the basket. I looked at him. He was doing something at the far end of the table, with a length of leather strap that needed restitching. His head bent to the work, not looking at me. I said, "Cormac." He said, I said, "I can carry the full basket." He said, "I know you can." He did not look up. I said, "Then why is this one half the size?" A pause. He set the strap down. He looked up not at me exactly, but at a point near me, the way people look when they are trying to decide how much of what they are thinking to commit to saying out loud. He said, "I just thought you shouldn't have to." There it was. The careful, considered kindness of a man who wanted a delicate woman and had received me instead, and was doing his best to retrofit the situation to provide for me the consideration he had intended to provide for the woman he had asked for, regardless of the obvious fact that I was not that woman and did not require it. I sat down across from him, not in anger, in the deliberate, direct way of someone who has decided that a thing needs to be said and is choosing to say it carefully because the person who needs to hear it is fragile in ways that have nothing to do with physical strength. I said, "Can I ask you something?" "About Clara." He stilled completely, the kind of stillness that is not relaxation, but its opposite. I said, "Was she delicate, the way you wrote for long silence?" I said, "I am not asking to cause you pain. I am asking because I think you have been trying to take care of her through me, through every woman you have been near since she was gone. And Cormac? I am not her. I do not need the small basket. But I want you to understand something." I looked at my hands. Large, calloused, the hands of someone who has been lifting full baskets since she was 12 years old. I said, "That does not mean there is nothing I need." He looked at me then, fully directly, not the cataloging look, and not the avoidance that preceded it. The full look of a man who has just been handed an uncomfortable truth and is deciding whether to set it down or hold on to it. I saw in his face the thing moving behind his eyes that I had seen before and not been able to name. I could name it now. It was grief, yes, but more specifically, it was the grief of a man who has been blaming himself for something for 4 years and has built his entire subsequent life around managing that blame in ways that look like other things. Practicality, careful organization, the desire for a certain kind of woman who would need to be protected so that he could be the person who protected her, because he had not protected Clara. He had said this once briefly in those first hard weeks, 3 sentences flat and factual, the way he said everything that cost him. But I had understood it more completely in the days since assembled from the small pieces. She had gone out in the blizzard to check the horses. He had said he would go. She said she would be fine, and he had let her go. That was the load he was carrying. That specific moment of letting her go. All the careful organization of his subsequent life. The heavy hammer that required deliberation. The small basket for someone who did not need the small basket. It was all arranged around that one moment, the attempt to build a life in which the equivalent of that moment could not occur again. And here I was, in the middle of that carefully constructed architecture, entirely the wrong shape for any of it. He got up and went outside. I sat at the table for a while after the door closed. Then I went to the window and looked up the rise at the dark shape of the forge against the evening sky, its chimney quiet, the day's fire long since banked. I thought about May on the ship describing the loneliness of being seen as furniture. And I thought about the dress on the hook behind the door and what it meant that it was still there and what kind of courage it would take to move it. Not to discard it, just to move it somewhere that was not the first place you saw when you came through the door of your own house. I thought about the letter in the box on the shelf, and I made a decision, not a dramatic decision, not the kind that announces itself with trumpet sounds or a sudden clarity that resolves all questions at once. The quiet kind of decision that you make the way you approach a piece of iron at the right temperature steadily with both hands, knowing that the window of possibility is limited and that hesitation has its own costs. I decided to stay. Not because of the forge, though the forge was real, and the stakes were real, and 60 days was a deadline that did not have flexibility. Not because of Doc Abernathy's practical accounting of the legal situation. Not because I had no other options, because I had some, though none of them were particularly appealing. I decided to stay because Cormac Daly had looked at my hands on the street in Denton Falls and not put me back on the wagon. Because he had made room on the wagon seat. Because he had said his father and my father had said the same thing about tools. Because underneath all the careful management of his grief and his guilt, there was a man who was genuinely good at iron and genuinely lost at everything else. And I understood both of those conditions from the inside and knew with the certainty of someone who has spent a lifetime reading the temperature of things that there was something here worth the heat required to work it. He came back in an hour later. He did not apologize, and I did not expect him to. He sat down across from me, and he said, in the voice of someone who has been outside in the cold, working something through Clara was not delicate. She was one of the most capable women I have ever known. She could do most things better than most men, and she did not make any particular effort to hide it. He looked at his hands. He said, "I think I wrote delicate because I was afraid. Afraid of a capable woman who might decide to go check on the horses herself instead of letting me do it. Afraid that if I got someone like that, I might lose her the same way. Because the loss of Clara was not when it came down to the honest accounting of it about her fragility. She was not fragile. The loss of Clara was about the moment I could have gone and didn't." Silence. I said quietly, "That is the most honest thing you've said since I arrived." He said, "It's probably the most honest thing I've said in 4 years." We sat with that for a moment, both of us aware that something had just shifted in the structure of whatever we were building, a beam settling into place that changed the load distribution of everything around it. He said, "I'm not sure what I'm doing here, Bridget." I said, "Neither am I. But I think we might be doing it together, which is a start." He almost smiled. Not quite. The ghost of it, the architecture of a smile without the completed expression. But the architecture was there, and that was something I had not seen before. That night late, when the cabin was quiet, I heard something in the main room. I lay still and listened. Nothing more. Just the wind outside and the creak and the settling of the timber in the cold. But in the morning, when I came through the main room to start the day, I noticed that the hook behind the door was empty. The blue dress was gone. Not discarded. I found it later when I went to hang up a coat folded carefully on the shelf of the side cupboard, placed with a deliberateness that spoke of something that had required considerable effort and had been done slowly and with full attention. It was not gone. It was just not in the first place you saw when you came through the door. I stood and looked at that folded dress for a long moment. Then I went to start the forge. It was a cold morning, and the fire took its time to build the way fires do when the air is wet with coming snow, and the coal is sitting at the temperature of a room that has been closed all night. I worked the bellows steadily, not rushing, not impatient, the way my father had taught me. You give the fire the conditions it needs, and you let it find its own strength. You cannot build a fire faster than the fire is ready to build. You can only provide the right circumstances and pay attention. I was kneeling at the hearth, working the bellows, when I heard him on the walkway. His footsteps had become familiar to me already in the way that things become familiar when you are paying close attention, the particular rhythm and weight of them, the way they paused briefly at the forge door, the same way mine had on the first morning, the half-second of stillness before the latch lifted. He came in. He saw me at the hearth. He went to the anvil. He picked up his hammer. We did not speak. The fire built between us slowly and then all at once, and the forge filled with its own particular warmth, and outside the mountain was beginning its morning in the unhurried, comprehensive way that mountains do without reference to the small concerns of the people arranged on its slopes. I thought about what Doc Abernathy had said. About the prairie knowing the difference between what you ask for and what you need. I was not sure I believed in the prairie having opinions. I had said so, but I was beginning to think that if the prairie did have opinions this particular morning, in this particular forge with the fire coming up clean and the hammer finding its rhythm, and the snow starting quiet and purposeful outside the high windows, the prairie's opinion and mine might not be entirely different things. We had 53 days. There was work to do. I picked up the tongs and turned to the fire, and somewhere behind me, steady and deliberate and exactly right, the hammer came down on iron. The snow came in earnest on the 12th day. Not the tentative exploratory snow of early October that arrives and retreats and arrives again as if uncertain of its welcome, but the committed snow of a mountain that has made up its mind coming down in the particular straight purposeful way of high-altitude snowfall that has no wind behind it and does not need any the weight of it sufficient on its own to change the character of everything it touches. I stood in the doorway of the forge that morning and watched it come and felt in the specific way that people who have spent their lives in physical work feel the weather not just as temperature and visibility, but as a set of practical implications requiring immediate and careful thought. The lumber commission needed to be completed before the road east became impassable. The coal supply needed to be assessed against the length of winter Cormac was anticipating. The covered walkway between the cabin and the forge had a section of roofing that had been patched and would need attention before the snow load became serious. I was making this list in my head, standing in the doorway, with my breath making its small clouds in the cold air, when Cormac appeared beside me. He stood looking at the snow for a moment. Then he said, 3 weeks early this year. I said, is the walkway roof going to hold? He looked at me. Then he looked at the walkway. Then back at the snow. He said, the middle section. I patched it in August, but I wasn't satisfied with the patch. I said I'll need timber and nails and someone to hold the ladder. He said I can hold the ladder. I said, you're heavier than me and a better smith. You should finish the commission hooks. I'll do the roof. A pause. The pause of a man who was working through the arithmetic of this arrangement and finding reluctantly that it was correct, while simultaneously navigating the portion of himself that objected to the conclusion on grounds that had nothing to do with arithmetic. He said, it'll be slippery up there. I said, I grew up on a coast. Everything is slippery. I'll manage. Another pause. Shorter this time. He said, the timber is in the lean-to behind the forge. Third stack from the left is the right gauge. He went back inside and picked up his hammer, and I went to the lean-to and found the timber exactly where he said it would be. And we spent the morning in this way, each doing the work that was ours to do. The forge ringing steadily from inside, while I worked on the walkway roof above it, in the falling snow, with the particular focused attention that height and cold and important work require. It was not comfortable work. It was cold, and the footing was precisely as slippery as he had warned, and there were 2 moments when I adjusted my position on the ladder with more urgency than I would have preferred. But the patch held. More than held. When I came down and walked the length of the walkway testing the repair, it was sound in a way the original patch had not been the kind of soundness that comes from doing a job without rushing it. I put the ladder away and came back inside and went directly to the fire to warm my hands, which had gone beyond cold into the specific unhelpfulness of very cold hands that are not yet responding properly to instruction. Cormac looked up from the commission piece. He looked at my hands, then at my face, which probably communicated something about the temperature situation without my intending it to. He went to the back of the forge without comment and came back with a pair of heavy work gloves. Old ones, worn soft and pliable from years of use. He set them on the workbench near where I was standing. He said, for next time. He went back to his work. I looked at the gloves. They were his. I could see the particular shaping of them, the way long use molds leather to the specific geography of the hands that have used it, and these had been shaped by hands somewhat larger than mine, but not as much larger as you might expect. I put them on. They were not a perfect fit, but they were close, and more importantly, they were warm in the deep-stored way of leather that has been near a forge fire for years. I did not say thank you out loud. I did not think that was quite the right register for the moment. Instead, I picked up the task I had been working on before the roof and continued working, and the gloves were warm on my hands, and neither of us mentioned them again. I was beginning to understand how Cormac daily communicated the things he did not have words for. Not through speech, through placement, the 3 inches of space on the wagon seat, the small basket which had been replaced the following morning by the full-sized one without discussion. The gloves on the workbench. He arranged things. He positioned objects and adjusted spaces and made room in the physical world for things that he could not yet make room for in the spoken one. I found this unexpectedly a language I was fluent in. In my father's forge, we had operated on similar principles. Da was not an articulate man in the conventional sense. He did not narrate his feelings or discuss his interior life. He expressed things through the work, through the way he positioned a tool for you to find, through the particular commission he chose to teach you. When you were ready for a new level of difficulty, through the piece he made for you, without explanation, and left on the table for you to discover. I had grown up reading this language, and speaking it in return, and I had not until I arrived in Cormac Daly's forge found anyone else who used it. The commission hooks were finished on the 14th day ahead of the deadline before the eastern road became impassable. Cormac loaded them onto the wagon himself, and I helped him cover them against the snow, and we stood in the yard for a moment afterward looking at the loaded wagon. He said, "I'll be gone most of the day. I said, I'll start on the hinges for the Hendersons. He looked at me. The Henderson order was the next commission, a set of gate hinges for a ranch south of town, work we had discussed but not yet begun. It was well within my capacity, and he knew this. What he was working through was something else, the recalibration of a man who has been a one-person operation for 4 years and is adjusting to the fact that his operation is no longer one person and that this adjustment is permanent rather than temporary. He said, the stock iron for the Hendersons is on the second shelf right side. I said, I know. I organized that shelf on Tuesday. A beat. He said, right. He climbed up onto the wagon. The horses moved. He was halfway down the hill when he pulled them up for a moment, and I thought he was going to say something, but he did not. He just sat there for a moment, and then the horses moved again, and he went down the hill, and around the bend, and out of sight. I went into the forge and started on the Henderson hinges. It was a good morning's work. I had the forge to myself, which was its own particular pleasure, not because Cormac's presence was unwelcome, but because working alone in a forge has a quality of conversation with the material that changes when there is another person in the room, becomes something more collaborative and therefore different in kind. Both kinds are valuable. Both are their own thing. That morning alone with the fire and the iron and the snow coming down outside the high windows, I worked with the simple absorption of someone doing a thing they have always known how to do, and doing it well. I was finishing the third hinge when I heard the wagon coming back up the hill, earlier than expected, and I looked up as Cormac came through the forge door with his coat still on, and snow on his shoulders, and an expression that was doing its best to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. I set the tongs down. He said Earl was at the lumber operation. He said it the way you say the name of a weather system that has arrived before the forecast predicted, not with surprise exactly because you knew it was coming, but with the particular flat effect of someone confronting the gap between when they hoped a thing would happen and when it is actually happening. I said, what did he say? Cormac said, he said he was there on business. He said it the way Earl said everything. His mouth smiled. His words were reasonable. His eyes were somewhere else entirely doing a separate calculation. He came in fully and took off his coat and hung it. He stood for a moment with his back to me, and then he turned and said, he mentioned you. By name. He said he hoped you were settling in comfortably. He said the mountain can be hard on newcomers. I said, he was reminding you that I am a variable he is watching. Cormac said, that is exactly what he was doing. I said, then we should assume he is watching everything. The forge, the commission, work the financial situation. He wants to know if there is any weakness he can move on before the 60 days are up. Cormac sat down on the stool near the anvil, which was not a thing I had seen him do before in the middle of a working day. He sat on it the way a man sits when the weight he is carrying has become for a moment heavier than his legs want to manage. He said, I have been fighting this alone for 8 months. I did not know how to do it. I am not whatever else I am, a man who knows how to fight in the way that Earl fights. He uses paper and language, and the particular kind of patience that people with money use when they can afford to wait longer than the person they are waiting out. I said, that is his advantage and his limitation both. Paper can be answered with paper. He looked at me. I said, Doc told me the original note showed $400. You said you found a partial page in your father's papers. Where are the rest of your father's papers? Cormac said, in the box under the floor. What I found was only 1 page of what should have been 2. I said, is there anywhere else your father kept documents? A second location, something he might have given to someone for safekeeping. Cormac thought. The thinking kind of silence, not the other kind. Then something moved in his face. He said, Doc Abernathy. My father trusted Doc with everything. I said, have you asked him? A pause that contained, I thought, a fairly significant portion of Cormac Daly's characteristic difficulty with asking for help. He said no. I said, then that is where we start. We went to Doc Abernathy's office that afternoon through the snow walking because the road was no longer easy for the wagon. Doc's office was a single room that smelled of medicines and old books and the pipe that Doc had given up apparently sometime in the previous decade, but whose ghost still inhabited the curtains. Doc himself was at his desk, his pen moving in the small, compressed script of a man who had spent 40 years fitting an entire county's worth of medical history into whatever paper came to hand. He looked up when we came in. He looked at us together, the two of us, in the way that Doc looked at everything completely and immediately, and without pretending he was doing otherwise. He said, "Sit down, both of you." We sat. Cormac told him what I had asked about his father's papers. When he finished, Doc was quiet for a moment. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the deep one, and lifted out a wooden box that was the twin of the one under Cormac's floor. The same dimensions, the same plain construction. He set it on the desk between us. He said, "Your father gave me this for safekeeping in the winter of '83. He said he did not trust it in the cabin because Clara was ill that winter, not seriously, but enough that there was a great deal of coming and going, and Seamus Daly was a man who believed in keeping certain things in a secure location during uncertain times." Cormac looked at the box. "Doc said I should have thought of it when you told me about Earl's document." "I am sorry, Cormac. I am not as young as I was, and the box had been in that drawer so long I had stopped seeing it." Cormac reached out and opened the box. Inside were papers, several of them folded and arranged with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that these documents mattered and handled them accordingly. Cormac went through them slowly, and I sat beside him and did not rush him, because this was his father's handwriting and his father's life on paper, and that required its own pace. He found it on the fourth document. A promissory note. 2 pages, both present, dated 1879. $400 terms, clearly stated a repayment schedule with amounts and dates, and at the bottom, a witness signature. Theodore Marsh, Notary, Denver. Cormac held it very still. I leaned over and looked at it carefully. The ink was old, but completely legible. The signature was clear. The terms were unambiguous. I said, "Is this the signature Doc mentioned? Theodore Marsh?" Doc said Marsh was the county notary out of Denver for 30 years. He's been retired for 6, but he's still living. Still completely sound of mind last I heard. I said, "Then this document with a statement from Marsh confirming the signature stands against whatever Earl Hutchins has produced." Doc looked at me over his spectacles. He said, "It does, provided we can get it in front of the right people before Earl moves on the debt." I said, "How long do we have?" Doc said, "If my arithmetic is right, 38 days. Cormac set the document down on Doc's desk. He looked at it for a long moment, then he looked at me. The full direct look, not the cataloging one, and not the careful management of it, but the one underneath all of that, the one that was simply honest. He said, "You asked the right question, about where else my father kept things." I said, "Someone had to." Doc cleared his throat in the gentle, specific way of a man who has witnessed a moment and is choosing not to remark on it directly. He said, "I'll write to Marsh this evening. Now, there is something else you need to know, and I have been trying to find the right moment to tell you, and I think that moment is probably now while you are both sitting in my office and the document is in front of us." We looked at him. Doc said Earl Hutchins did not come by that inflated debt note through ordinary legal means. I have reason to believe that the document he is presenting was not created recently. I believe it was created over a period of years, adjustments made gradually small enough at each stage to be deniable. Which means Earl has been planning this for longer than you know Cormac. He has been waiting for the right moment, the right set of circumstances. Cormac said the right moment being when I was alone, and not in a condition to look carefully at documents. Doc said, "Yes." The word landed in the room and stayed there. I looked at Cormac's face. He was doing the controlled anger that I recognized by now, the specific quality of absolute stillness that he maintained when the anger was at its most present. His hands were flat on his knees. His jaw was set. He was looking at a point on Doc's desk somewhere to the left of the document, not at the document itself. I said nothing. Sometimes the only right thing is to let a man be still for a moment and not fill the silence with anything. After a while, he said quietly, "He waited until Clara was gone. He waited until I was at my lowest, and then he moved." Doc said, "That is my belief, yes," Cormac said, "and if I had not written to the agency, if Bridget had not come." Doc said, I think you know the answer to that. Another long silence. Then Cormac picked up the document from Doc's desk carefully and folded it along its original creases and put it inside his coat close to his chest. He stood up. He said, "Write to Marsh tonight, Doc, and thank you for keeping this." Doc said, "Your father was a good man. Keeping his things safe was no hardship." We walked back up the hill through the snow, Cormac and I, without speaking. The snow had eased to something lighter, still coming down, but without the earlier commitment, and the light was going the particular way it goes in mountain evenings in early winter, quickly and completely the day, not so much ending as being removed. Halfway up the hill, Cormac said without preamble or segue, as if continuing a conversation that had been happening inside him and had simply now reached the point of requiring external expression, "I owe you something I am not sure I know how to say." I said, "You do not owe me anything." He said, "You asked where else my father kept things." I had that box in the back of my mind for 2 years, and I had not gone to ask Doc because I had convinced myself there was nothing in it. Because it was easier to believe there was nothing in it than to go and look and find there was nothing in it and have the last possibility closed off. I said, "I know." He said, "You knew that, and you asked anyway." I said, "You had stopped asking. Someone needed to start again." He stopped walking. I stopped beside him. We were standing on the hill in the snow, the forge above us and the town below us, and the mountains very close and very certain on all sides. And he looked at me with the expression I had been waiting for since I arrived, and had not been sure I would see the one where all the cataloging and the careful management and the organized grief stepped back for a moment, and the man himself was simply present in his own face. He said, "I do not know yet what this is, what we are. I want to be honest with you about that because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort." I said, "I agree with that completely." He said, "But I think you may be the most useful person I have ever met. And I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give." I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "Cormac Daly, that is the most useful thing anyone has ever said to me." We stood there for another moment, both of us aware that something had been said that could not be unsaid, and that this was correct, that it needed to be said, that the saying of it had changed the weight distribution of everything around it. Then I said, "The Henderson hinges need a second heat in the morning." He said, "Third hinge is running slightly wide, I noticed." I said, "I noticed too. I was going to correct it tomorrow." He said, "I know." I wasn't commenting, only observing. We went back up the hill without speaking. He banked the fire. I watched him do it. Neither of us said anything more about what had passed between us on the hillside. We did not need to. It was already in the room. It was May who changed everything, and she came on a morning when Earl was in the next town at a business meeting, and she had for once an unaccounted-for portion of her day. I saw her coming up the hill from the window of the forge where I was working alone, Cormac having gone to the south pasture to deal with a fence issue that the snow had revealed. She was walking quickly, not the leisurely pace of a social call, and she was carrying nothing, no basket, no parcel, nothing that would explain the visit to anyone watching. This told me the visit was not intended to be explained to anyone watching. I went to meet her at the forge door. She looked different from the ship. She was the same woman, the same careful clothes and composed face, but something in the composition had shifted. On the ship, she had looked like a woman who had made peace with a particular kind of constraint and was managing it with dignity. Now, she looked like a woman who had been reconsidering that peace for some time and had arrived at some point between then and now at a different conclusion. Her eyes, when she saw me, had the same recognition they had shown on the street the day I arrived, the day she had not been able to speak to me because Earl was there. This time, there was no Earl. I said, "Come inside. I'll get coffee." She came in and stood near the forge fire, warming her hands with the unconscious gratitude of someone who has been cold and is now less cold, and I brought the coffee from the small stove in the corner, where I kept water hot through the working day, and she wrapped both hands around the cup. She said, "I have been trying to find a moment since the day you arrived." I said, "I know. I saw you on the street." She said, "He watches more than people think. Even when he seems occupied with something else, he is always noting. Who speaks to whom? Who goes where? What conversations happen in what proximity to his business interests? It is I have come to understand simply how he moves through the world. Everything is information. Everything is leverage potentially. She said this without particular bitterness. The way you describe a weather pattern you have been living with long enough that description has replaced emotion. I said, "How long have you known about the debt note?" She said, "I found the original in his papers 2 years ago. I was not looking for it. I was looking for our marriage certificate because I needed it for a legal matter concerning my own family's property, and I found what I found. I understood immediately what it was. I understood what it meant." I said, "And you kept it?" She looked at me over her coffee cup. She said, "I have been keeping a great many things for a great many years, Bridget. It is a skill I developed early and have perhaps over-relied upon." She set the cup down. She said, "I made a copy of the document 2 years ago. I made it carefully, completely, including the witness signatures and the original terms. I have been keeping it. I did not know what to do with it. I did not know if there was anything to do with it, or if I had the standing to do anything, or if the doing of anything would create consequences I was not prepared to manage." She opened her coat. Inside, folded into a pocket that had been sewn into the lining, the kind of interior pocket that a woman makes when she needs to carry something she cannot afford to have found, was a piece of paper. She put it on the workbench between us. I did not touch it yet. I looked at her. She said, "I saw you arrive. I watched you lift that trunk." And I thought of our conversation on the ship, about staying somewhere that already knows what to think of you. And I thought, here is a woman who does not stay when staying is wrong. Here is a woman who might know what to do with this. I said, "May, you know what he will do if he finds out you gave me this?" She said, "Yes." The word was simple and complete, and contained within it a great deal that had already been decided before she walked up that hill. I said, "Where will you go, if it comes to that?" She said, "I have a sister in Denver. I have not spoken to her in 4 years because Earl believed her a bad influence, by which he meant she had opinions and expressed them and did not particularly adjust them based on who was in the room." She almost smiled. She said, "I have recently come to think of this as a recommendation rather than a warning." I reached out and picked up the document. I unfolded it carefully and read it completely, every line, the terms and the dates and the figures and the signature of Theodore Marsh at the bottom, clear and unambiguous and exactly matching the document that Cormac had found in Doc's box. I folded it along its creases and held it. I said, "This combined with the original that Cormac has located and a statement from Marsh confirming his signature will stand against what Earl is presenting." May said, "That is what I believed." I said, "You could have given this to a lawyer directly. You did not need to give it to me." She said, "A lawyer would have used it in a way that could be traced back through the legal process. You will use it differently, I think. I think you will use it in a way that puts it in front of the people who need to see it without giving Earl time to respond before they have already seen it." I looked at her. She looked back at me with the calm, direct expression of a woman who has been paying careful attention to her situation for a long time and has drawn accurate conclusions. I said, "That took courage, May. Coming here." She said, "I told you on the ship. I think being tired enough and being brave enough might be the same thing." She finished her coffee. She stood up and buttoned her coat. She was about to go when she stopped, and there was something in her face that was different from everything before it. Something younger and less composed, something that had been under the composed surface and was showing through it now, just for a moment. She said, "Is he good to you, Cormac Daly?" I thought about it genuinely before answering. I said, "He is learning to be, and I believe he will get there." She nodded. She went to the door. At the door, she paused in that particular way that people pause at doors when the thing they are leaving is significant, not for the drama of it, but simply because the leaving deserves a moment of acknowledgement. She said, "Good luck to you, Bridget Fallon." I said, "Good luck to you, May. Call on your sister." She walked down the hill, and I stood in the forge doorway and watched her go, growing smaller against the white of the snow, until she reached the main street and was among the buildings and gone. I looked at the document in my hand. Then I put it in my own coat in the interior pocket where it would not be found without intention. and I went back to the Henderson hinges. I told Cormac that evening. He sat across from me at the table, and I set the document in front of him, alongside the one he had taken from Doc's box, and he looked at both of them for a long time. He said, "She gave you this, May Hutchins." I said, "Yes." He said, "Knowing what Earl would do if he found out." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. He looked at the two documents side by side, the original, and May's careful copy, identical in every material detail. He said, "And Marcia's statement from Doc's letter." I said, "When it comes." "Yes." He said, "That is 3 things. The original, the copy, with a witness to the copying, and a statement from the notary confirming his signature." I said, "Earl's document against all 3 of those will not hold." Cormac looked up from the papers. He said, "You have been planning this." I said, "I have been paying attention," which is a different thing, but the difference is small. He said, "And the council meeting. 30 days from now." I said, "If we present this before the council, rather than in a private legal setting, it becomes a matter of public record immediately. Earl cannot suppress a public record. He can suppress a private negotiation, but not a public one." Cormac was watching me with the expression I had learned to read as his version of something that other men expressed more openly. Not quite wonder. Something more considered than wonder, the considered version of it, the version that has been processed through a mind that does not accept things quickly, but once it has accepted them, accepts them completely. He said, "How do you know to think this way?" I said, "My father taught me that iron does not lie, but people do. And the best defense against a person who is lying with paper is better paper and more of it." He said, "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." I said he was. He was also occasionally completely wrong about things and entirely unwilling to admit it, which is perhaps a different kind of wisdom. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile exactly, but the muscles that had forgotten how to make one were remembering. He said, "That sounds familiar." I looked at him. He was looking at the documents again, not at me, but the quality of his stillness had changed. It was warmer than any stillness I had seen from him before, and I thought that this was what Cormac Daly looked like when he was, for the first time in a long time, not bracing for something. I said, "Cormac, there is something I want to say to you, and I want to say it plainly." He looked up. I said, "I found your letter, the draft you wrote to the agency. I found it some weeks ago when I was looking for wire on the back shelf." He went completely still. I said, "I am not angry about it. I am telling you because I think we have been doing something in this house and this forge that deserves honesty as a foundation. And honesty means I tell you I found it and tell you what I felt about it." He said very quietly, "What did you feel?" I said, "I felt what I always feel when I read a list of the things I am not. The specific version of tired that comes from being the wrong shape in a world that has already decided what shape it wanted." He did not look away. I had given him an opening to look away, and he did not take it. I said, "But I also felt something else. I felt that the man who wrote those words and the man who looked at my hands on the street and did not put me back on the wagon were not entirely the same man, and that the distance between them was something I might be able to respect." Silence. He said, "The man who wrote those words. I think he was a man who was afraid, who was trying to build a situation in which the specific thing he was most afraid of could not happen." I said, "I know. I understood that." He said, "And the man on the street," I said, "was starting to be something else, something that did not have the fear as its organizing principle." He looked at the lamp flame for a moment. The particular quality of his stillness had shifted. Not the controlled management of emotion, not the careful engineering of distance. Something more open than either of those things. He said, "I have been trying to protect every woman near me since Clara died. I understand that now. I understand that it is not protection exactly. It is the management of my own terror. You told me this weeks ago, and I went outside and stood in the cold and was angry about it, and then I came back in, and I thought about it for a long time. And you were right. I said, I know I was. I was not gentle about saying it. He said no. But you were honest. And I have had a great deal of gentle over the past 4 years, and none of it has helped particularly. He paused. Honesty is better, even when it is cold. Outside, the snow had started again, lighter now, the kind of late evening snow that is more atmosphere than weather. The lamp made a circle of warmth around the table, and beyond it, the room was in comfortable shadow. I said, I am going to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly, the way you just said you prefer honesty. He said, ask. I said, when this is resolved, when Earl Hutchins has been answered, and the forge is secure, and the 60 days are behind us. What do you want this to be? He looked at me for a long time. The kind of long time that is not hesitation, but genuine consideration, the kind that takes the question seriously enough to sit with it before answering. He said, I want it to be what it has been becoming. Whatever that is. I am aware I have not been particularly transparent about this. I am aware I have not made it easy for you to know what I am thinking or feeling, because I have spent 4 years not knowing what I am thinking or feeling, and I got fairly good at disguising the fact. I said, you are somewhat more legible than you believe, to someone paying attention. He said, you have been paying attention. I said, it is what I do. Iron people's situations. I learned it young, and I have never stopped. He said, I know. He looked at his hands on the table. They were a blacksmith's hands and a widower's hands, and 4 years of solitary mornings all written in the same skin. I have been watching too, in the way I know how to, which is not loud and is probably not obvious. But I want you to know, it has not been nothing. I said, it has been sufficient. He looked up. I said, the gloves, the full basket, the way you hold the ladder so it does not move even slightly when I am on it, the way you adjusted your position at the anvil that first morning to account for a second person in the space. These things are expressive, Cormac. They are just expressed in a language that most people do not know how to read. He said, you read it. I said, my father spoke it. I grew up fluent. The lamp flickered once in a draft from somewhere and steadied again. Outside, the snow continued its quiet, purposeful descent over the mountain. He said, Bridget. I said, yes. He said, when this is done. When Earl is answered and the forge is clear. I would like to ask you something. Properly. Not as an arrangement or a legal strategy or a practical solution to a practical problem. I looked at him. At the face that had given so little away for so long, and was giving something now carefully, and with the full attention of a man who has decided that this particular door is one he is going to open rather than manage from a safe distance. I said, when the time comes, ask. He nodded. Once. The way he nodded at things that were settled. We sat for a while longer at the table with the lamp between us, and the snow outside, and the documents with their accumulated importance lying there beside the coffee cups, and neither of us said anything more that evening because nothing more needed saying. The fire in the forge was banked, but not out. It would be ready in the morning, and 30 days from now, in a council chamber in Denton Falls, Colorado. 2 women who had met on a ship in the Atlantic, and a man who had spent 4 years learning the hard way that the things you ask for and the things you need are not always the same item, were going to walk into a room and place 3 pieces of paper on a table. And everything was going to change. But that is the part of the story that comes next. For now, there was only this. The lamp, the snow, the warmth of the banked forge above us on the hill, and 2 people at a table who had arrived at a place that neither of them had known to look for, and both of them, in their different ways, had needed more than they knew. 30 days. I had come 3,000 miles for a life that had room for me. I had not expected to find it. I had not expected him. But the forge was warm, the documents were on the table, and Cormac Daly had just told me he intended to ask me something properly when the time came. I had been waiting my whole life for a harder question than that. I could wait 30 more days.